Well, let's jump in. Looks like we got a more than quorum on there. So first, welcome everybody to CalWild's post-election webinar. Thank you so much for joining. Many of you, if not all of you, are supporters, many longtime supporters of CalWild's work. We still appreciate that support. It's helped sort of sustain us over these last 4 years of quite a few projects and threats to California's public lands. Helped us to push back on oil and gas leasing and logging projects, help us to really sue actually the Trump administration with collaboration of Earth Justice and the Western Environmental Law Center. You work in acronyms that you forget sometimes. But on the National Environmental Policy Act, which is sort of one of the most critical tools we use to protect California's wild places, and the border wall, which is now running right through the Jacumba wilderness down on the southern border. We did a lot of work with our partners in the Public Lands Defense Network, and we even sort of made some progress. The Great American Outdoors Act passed this year, which fully funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And our bills are as far as they've ever gotten. So exciting times, somewhat uncertain in lots of ways, but that's why we got a great cast here to help all of you navigate that, me included. I'd like to just take a quick second to thank some of our sponsors, just a voter sponsor, Richard Mora and Matt Cuman, and our poll worker sponsor through Sue Barton and Dawn Morrill. We're doing sort of webinars and online engagement in lieu of some of the in-person work that we've done over the years. So if you are interested in being a sponsor for one of these webinars, we're hoping to maintain them sort of regardless, and hopefully as COVID fades quicker rather than later, although that's not looking good these days. But we want to stay in touch. So we'll use these opportunities to connect with you, to share information, and really get the word out about what's happening on California's public lands. So you can reach out to me and I'll put my email in the chat box. The other thing to note, and I will again, is the chat box will be the best place for any questions as we move along throughout the evening. So tonight, as I mentioned, we're going to review a little bit about the election results, and really what does it mean for California public lands. There's a lot of changes both in the California delegation, what's happened nationally, and we have a team here that will really help us all navigate it. So let me introduce them. Ryan Henson is CalWild's policy director. He's helped lead CalWild's conservation efforts for the last 25 years. He continues to provide vision and strategic guidance both internally at CalWild as well as being one of the state leaders on public lands policy and management. Linda Castro is CalWild's assistant policy director and assists with the overall strategy of CalWild's advocacy work. She's also the lead staff member on our desert protection and defense work, and the Central Coast and San Gabriel campaigns, and a primary contact for many of the congressional offices around the state. Jim Matthews is an officer at the Pew Charitable Trust's U.S. Public Lands and Rivers Conservation Program. Based in D.C., he works with local coalitions to develop wilderness proposals and help shepherd them through the federal legislative process. Jim has over 40 years experience in government affairs, including serving as a staffer in both the House and the Senate. David Feynman joined Conservation Lands Foundation as Government Affairs Director in 2017, where he focuses on maintaining and growing both congressional as well as grassroots support for the national conservation lands. Prior to CLF, he served as the Washington representative for both the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany and World Jewish Restoration Organization from 2014 to 2017, as well as Senior Legislative Associate and Project Director for the Jewish Federations of North America from 2010 to 2014. David began his career in Washington as a legislative aide for former Congressman Robert Wexler of Florida from 2007 to 2010, and for former Congresswoman Shelley Berkeley of Nevada in 2006. I want to especially thank David and Jim for taking time out to join us, although being late on their end. They're joining us from DC. So really appreciate it. All right, I'm going to pass this now to Ryan, who will kind of get us started on an introduction and start moving on the project. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll answer them at least in our question and answer section. And I might interject at the end of a couple of places if they're relevant. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. And Ryan, take it away.
All right, thank you, Chris. So let's start with some basics. First of all, CalWild's mission is to protect wild places, certain wild lands and waters around the state. The highest priority lands and waters for protection are often on California's public lands. And just to remind you about those public lands, California is about 104 million acres in size, and of that, over 44% or over 44 million acres are public lands that belong to all Californians. And most of those public lands fall under the purview of the White House and under Congress. And that's primarily four agencies: the U.S. Forest Service, which manages 20 million acres, the Bureau of Land Management, which manages 15 million acres, and the National Park Service, which manages 8 million acres. And then lastly, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which only manages 279,000 acres. But federal elections really matter for these areas of federal public lands. The federal agencies listed here are ultimately controlled by the President of the United States. And the budgets for these agencies are set by Congress. And Congress also has the ability to both protect these public lands or to open them to development. So having explained now why elections are important for public lands, let's go right into the election. And the first office, the White House.
So I think that's my cue. I did not prepare any slides. I think most folks have probably been following the news, if not actually riveted to it. I was just checking this afternoon while Vice President Biden has been confirmed as having won the election. I've noticed on multiple sites, they all have a different number of electoral votes that he's gained, ranging from 279 to 310. So as you know, a couple of the states are still undecided. Georgia's in a recount, but the bottom line is that Mr. Biden will be the next president and Senator Harris will be the next vice president to be sworn in on January 20th. I think, you know, it goes without saying that this will be a huge difference for public lands issues in general. Those efforts to protect public lands, whether it's wilderness or national monuments, how they're managed by the Forest Service and BLM, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, all should improve drastically. Unfortunately, in the next month and a half, almost 2 months, a lot more damage can be done. I saw that the current administration is offering leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They continue to build the border wall, notwithstanding legal decisions, court decisions that have gone against them. So while there's good news ahead, we still have to face the current administration for the next couple months. and hope that too much damage isn't done. There's also the concern that the current president will not give up the fight. He's lost, I think, 20 court cases related to the election. He has won one small one, and continues, of course, to tweet his heart out on how unfair and illegal the elections were. It's as someone who's spent his entire professional life inside the Beltway, having worked for both Democrats and Republicans, I find this extremely unnerving. The fact that very, very few elected Republicans have congratulated Vice President Biden on winning the election. Many of them are actually saying the election is still up for grabs, still in doubt. We're faced with a couple months of uncertainty. And this will all have an impact on what President Biden and Vice President Harris can do when they take office. You've probably seen reports that because the president has not accepted defeat, the General Services Administration has not signed the documents to authorize an official, excuse me, an official transition to take place where Vice President Biden and Senator Harris would be getting various briefings. Their staff would be able to be meeting with agency and departmental staff, White House staff, to get the transition in shape and order. So, notwithstanding that, Biden and Harris have a transition team in place, a team that's made up of many volunteers from around the country, several people who are known in the field of conservation and the environment are part of this team. And again, most of them are volunteering their time. So they're doing what they can to get ready for the new administration, but it's one more hurdle to deal with. So, just wrap it up really quickly. I mean, all the news reports show that once he's president, Biden will try to undo as much of the damage that President Trump and his administration has done using the same weapons, which is primarily executive orders, and try to undo as much as possible as quickly as possible, and then get geared up and running for, working forward to improve the environment and protect the public lands. I think I'll leave it off there, open it up for questions. Again, to be honest, you all probably know as much as I do just from following the news.
Assuming there are no immediate questions, and we can talk about that.
I'm sorry, very quickly, and I'm sorry, this is what happens when you don't really write, you only jot down a few notes for yourself. So with Senator Harris's election as vice president, I think this opens up, personally, I think this opens up a lot of potential for the administration, the very top of the administration, to get involved in issues that are of concern to all of us, again, especially conservation and public lands. She's been a real champion as a senator. She has several bills she's sponsored for designating wilderness and other protective statuses. And I think having her in the White House could be a huge boon especially for California, for public lands and conservation efforts if we can get her engaged early on to take this under her wing as one of her responsibilities. And then the flip side, while you lose a senator, you have a Democratic governor who can appoint another Democrat. I've seen a ton of names thrown out there as possibilities, all good, solid Democrats. Most, if not all, of the ones I've seen mentioned have, pretty good conservation environmental records. So it's a twofer. You're going to have someone in the White House, and you get a new senator who will be probably as good on conservation issues, if not better, than the current senator.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that particular point, Senator Harris has been great on these issues. But as somebody who's been actively lobbying her for 3.5 years, I'll say that we had to work to get her there. She naturally would have voted the right way, but to get her to commit to introduce bills and be an original co-sponsor for the 30 by 30 resolution in the Senate and the Antiquities Act defending all of the national monuments that were at risk from the Trump administration as examples, that took a lot of work from, frankly, probably many of the people on this webinar and folks from different communities across California who urged her to be more than just a token vote in the right place, but actually to take on these issues. And, I think she's done a really great job on all of the bills that are currently being considered in the Senate that she's leading. She's also really provided an important perspective on environmental justice relating to public lands that I think will be important if she does take a lead on these issues as vice president. But I think the most important point is that she wasn't naturally a leader on these issues when she came into the Senate. And so I think folks on this call, supporters of CalWild and other organizations who work on public lands in California, are responsible for that. And while I agree with Jim that probably anybody who's appointed to her seat in the Senate will be good on these issues, I don't know that we know from day one that they will be a champion, somebody who's proactively engaging. And so it'll be incumbent on us to once again move that person into that role as they settle into their appointment in the Senate and eventually have to get reelected. And so now, taking a look at the Senate, we have an interesting situation where 98 of the 100 seats are settled. The Republicans have the majority right now, and we're basically going to be waiting until January 5th to know what happens with the majority. If both of those seats in Georgia that are set for runoffs go to the Republicans, or if one of them goes to the Republicans, then the Republicans will maintain the majority, although by a very slim margin. If both seats go to the Democratic candidates, you're going to have, it's not the first time, it wouldn't be the first time it's happened. It's actually happened pretty frequently that you'll have a 50-50 Senate. And what breaks the tie is the vice president, who by Constitution is actually the president of the Senate. So Vice President Harris would be spending a lot of time breaking ties in the Senate. As much as she might want to leave the Senate, she might not. But you also will have a pretty interesting dynamic. And Jim, maybe I don't know if this happened while you were working in the Senate, but my understanding is when there's a 50-50 Senate, committees are evenly divided. And so even if you have a chairmanship on one end or the other, you're going to have a dynamic where it'll be hard to get bills through those committees if they don't have some level of bipartisan support.
Well, having been here for so long, I worked in the Senate when, and again, both when the Dems were in charge and when Republicans were in charge, you actually had senators talking to each other, working together, working across the aisle, actually debating issues on the floor, not with prepared remarks, but so But having said all of that, the Senate has become very polarized in recent years. I personally blame it on too many former House members becoming senators and wanting the Senate to operate more like the House. I think, though, that while there are some extremists in the Senate, that they'd have to find a way to work together. So you're not going to get everything you want, but you'll probably be able to stop really bad stuff, and you probably can get maybe half a loaf, depending on what the issue is. But it would really make Vice President Harris very busy, because that 50-50 split, I mean, she's going to have to be up there, quite frequently.
And to address the questions in the chat, Vice President Harris would be basically the tie-breaking vote for determining the majority. So by nature of the vice president being Democratic, Chuck Schumer would be the majority leader. And my understanding is the Democrats, who are the leads of each committee, would be the chairs by that measure of having the majority on that side. But by numbers on each committee, you would have the same number of people. So the Democrats would be able to determine the agenda, but when it actually comes down to voting, if somebody from one side doesn't go to the other, you're going to come to a tie on everything in every committee. So that, and vice presidents don't weigh in on those votes.
Yeah, and for floor votes, Harris would only be involved when there was a tie.
Yeah. And one last note just on that Senate being as polarized as it is in terms of the numbers. That's going to make it very hard for President Biden to move cabinet positions through. Frankly, either way, regardless of which party has the majority after these two seats are determined, it's going to be very hard for anybody who's perceived as too progressive to move through, because there's no guarantee that every Democrat is necessarily going to line up with a progressive candidate for any of the cabinet positions that he might be looking to appoint. And then in terms of the House, for those of you who follow Democratic politics, while many people might be very happy about the outcome of the White House, the spoiler was in the sense that the Democrats did not do very well in many swing seats and have lost a significant part of their majority. There are a number of seats that are still up for determination, including a few in California, which I think we'll talk about later. But the way it's looking now, the majority will probably be 222 to 213, which means basically 5 seats. That still gives Nancy Pelosi the speakership, presumably, and the power to set the agenda, which is important. But what it means is counting to 218 to get votes through the House is going to be very hard when you have very little margin for error. And when you have, dare I say, growing dissension between the moderate and progressive wings of the party, who are seeing very different paths forward to how they should govern. So Speaker Pelosi is going to have a lot of work on her hands in the next 2 years. And the other kind of residual effect of having such a small majority is this, as with the Senate, the size of the majority in each committee is going to be much smaller. And so I would venture to say in the House Natural Resources Committee, where the Dems, I believe, now have a 6 or 7 seat majority, it might only be 1 seat, perhaps 2. But what that means is bills that are not completely supported by every Democrat in the committee will not pass through the committee. So that changes, I think, the calculation of the type of legislation that Chair Raul Grijalva is going to be willing to bring up for hearings and markups.
All right, so now moving on to CalWild's agenda for next year, or actually next Congress. We're going to continue to work on permanently protecting key lands and waters. We'll be working on pushing for increased funding for key programs of the agencies that manage our federal public lands. We're going to work on strengthening protections for the California desert. We'll be fighting trespass marijuana cultivation on federal public lands. We'll work on wildfire policy reform, seek to undo Trump rollbacks and bad policies related to federal public lands. We're going to keep fighting destructive proposed projects, and we'll work at getting good agency land management plans approved.
All right, well, one of the most important things that we do is we work to pass legislation that'll permanently protect public lands and waters. What we're going to talk about now are the current land and water protection bills that we have before Congress, and their prospects for passage in light of the election. And the first one we'll talk about is Congressman Jared Huffman's Northwest California Wilderness Recreation and Working Forests Act. This bill covers the public lands of Mendocino and Humboldt, Del Norte, and Trinity counties, and will protect over 312,000 acres of public land as wilderness and over 479 miles of stream as wild and scenic rivers, among other things. So he, as I said, he represents Northwest California. Mr. Huffman is on the House Natural Resources Committee. He's the chairman of the WOW committee, the subcommittee, the Waters, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee. So my favorite acronym on Capitol Hill. Yeah, this is a bill that we've been working on since 2012. One of 4 bills that we have currently before Congress.
The next one is Representative Salud Carvajal's Central Coast Heritage Protection Act. That bill would protect areas in the Los Padres National Forest and the Carrizo Plain National Monument. The areas that would be protected hold at least 7 endangered species and many more rare threatened species, and many places that are culturally significant to local tribes. It would protect about 287,000 acres as wilderness and add about 160 miles of streams to the National Wild and Scenic River System. It would also designate 2 new scenic areas in Santa Barbara County and San Luis Obispo County, which would total about 35,000 acres. It would require the U.S. Forest Service to study the feasibility of a 400-mile trail that would stretch from Los Angeles County all the way to northern San Luis Obispo County. That would be called the Condor National Scenic Trail. And as you see there in the photo, there's a photo there of a condor. And for folks who aren't aware, the Los Padres National Forest has a really important sanctuary for the very endangered California condor. The next one is Representative Judy Chu's San Gabriel Mountains, Foothills, and Rivers Protection Act. That bill would protect areas in the Angeles National Forest in Los Angeles County, which is a very popular area for recreation for residents in the LA Metroplex. It would protect more than 30,000 acres as wilderness and about 45 miles of streams as wild and scenic rivers. It would expand the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument that was originally designated by President Obama back in 2014 by about 110,000 acres. And it would establish the San Gabriel National Recreation Area, which would stretch from the Angeles National Forest down into the Santa Fe Dam and Whittier Narrows recreation areas and down into the Puente Hills. And this national recreation area would be co-managed by the National Park Service and the local communities where it's going to be located. What's really neat is this area would be readily accessible to local communities by public transportation, which is not necessarily the case for the forest itself. The last one is Representative Adam Schiff's Rim of the Valley Corridor Preservation Act. This is a bill that we've only been working on tangentially together with the National Park Conservation Association and other groups. This bill would add about 191,000 acres in Los Angeles and Ventura counties to the existing Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, which was established in as a National Park Service unit in 1978 by President Jimmy Carter. It would also provide more local recreational opportunities for folks like me in Los Angeles and Ventura counties, which is much appreciated in these times of COVID. But even more importantly, it would protect vital wildlife linkages for species, in particular mountain lions that are so threatened by urbanization in Southern California.
Okay. So the in addition to the existing campaigns built around legislation, we're also always seeking new opportunities to work with different members of Congress to push legislation in their districts. And so now we're going to talk about some of the new bills that we'd like to pursue next year in light of the election.
So Representative Obernolte was the winner in the 8th Congressional District. It was a fairly close race, but his opponent conceded last Tuesday. The incumbent, Representative Paul Cook, retired from Congress. While Mr. Obernolte's track record on conservation and environmental issues is not good, to put it politely, we're hopeful that he'll consider introducing legislation to protect 2 areas. One, Conglomerate Mesa, is located just to the west of Death Valley National Park near the town of Lone Pine in Inyo County, and that's a photograph of it there on the left. And the second area is the Bodie Hills, which is located near Bridgeport in Mono County. Actually, the aspens behind me were photographed in that area. And both of these areas are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the other BLM, and both are threatened by gold mining.
All right. Well, one of the undecided races that David mentioned is in House District 21, which is in Fresno, Kern, Kings, and Tulare counties. And very importantly to CalWild, it includes over 174,000 acres of BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land, including the spectacular Joaquin Rocks area that very few folks have heard of. But for those of you who have, you'll get very excited to hear that. But Mr. Cox is in a very tight race with David Valadao. And last time I checked, they were, Mr. Cox was down by 2,065 votes, which is an improvement over the 2,350 he was at on Friday. So they still haven't called the race yet. And if Mr. Cox does win, we'd like to work with him to protect over 200,000 acres of public land in both his district, but also in the adjacent district of Congressman Panetta. This is the southern end of the Diablo Range, really amazing land that actually I recently learned is a desert. It's an ecological desert called the San Joaquin Desert. And Linda Castro and I didn't know that California had another desert in the San Joaquin Valley, technically speaking.
This is another undecided race. Christy Smith or Mike Garcia, the 25th Congressional District, which is located in northern Los Angeles County and Ventura County. And last I looked, Mr. Garcia was ahead by 104 votes. They keep going back and forth every couple of days where one's in the lead and then the other one's in the lead. And now Mr. Garcia is with 104 votes. That shows how important it is to vote. We hope to work with the winner of that race to permanently protect close to 70,000 acres of roadless areas in the non-contiguous northern portion of the Angeles National Forest. Dr. Ruiz ran for re-election, and last I checked, he had about 60% of the votes. However, last I looked, his opponent still had not conceded. I don't know if that has changed in the last day or two. Dr. Ruiz has really proven himself to be a real champion on conservation issues, but in particular in protecting California's desert. His office was instrumental in our pushback against the administration's proposed changes to the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan that was finalized in 2016. Dr. Ruiz also has a special affinity for Joshua Tree National Park. In fact, he proposed to his wife there. We hope to work with Dr. Ruiz to protect key lands and waters in Riverside County that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. We're still fleshing that proposal out, still doing some ground truthing, but we're thinking the bill would include additional wilderness, perhaps wild and scenic river protections, a new national monument, protections for some historically and recreationally important places, and perhaps the expansion of Joshua Tree National Park. While this area is important to a good number of rare and endangered species, this area is critically important to the survival of the iconic California desert tortoise. Representative Levin in the 49th Congressional District. We're really happy to see that Mr. Levin won re-election with a reasonably healthy margin, even though his district is in Orange County, or at least partially in Orange County. I believe that congressional district flipped the last time when he won. So that was great that he was reelected. He's been consistently good on conservation and environmental issues during his first term. He was also on the House Natural Resources Committee. And we hope to work with him to designate a creek in the southern Cleveland National Forest as a wild and scenic river, the San Mateo Creek, which is in San Mateo Canyon, which is also in San Mateo Canyon Wilderness. And we hope to protect that as a wild and scenic river.
And my dogs are barking, of course, when I have to speak. But so about 10 years ago, former Congressman Darrell Issa used to represent northern San Diego County, but California went through redistricting, and Mr. Issa was redistricted down to the coast, where he lost his seat to a Democrat and moved inland now back to where he used to be, San Diego County, northern San Diego County. And so why does that matter? Well, it matters because 10 years ago, he carried a wilderness bill. I know some of you were probably thinking, really? He was awful to President Obama, just terrible to President Obama, just an all-around jerk in many ways, but he carried a wilderness bill for us. And I took him out to an area in San Diego County called Beauty Mountain. His wife knew the name of every wildflower out there. And his wife said, honey, you should do the bill. So he did. He introduced that wilderness bill. And the only reason it didn't pass is his fellow Republicans obstructed it until he got redistricted, and then the bill was abandoned. So we'd like to talk him into reintroducing that bill. The place is called Beauty Mountain. It's in San Diego County, and the bill would enlarge it. It would double the size of the current Beauty Mountain Wilderness, which is divided in half between Dr. Ruiz's district and what is now Darrell Issa's district. So Yeah, so we're going to work with Darrell Issa of all people, or at least we hope to. Now, I forgot to ask Jim Matthews and David, if you'd like to comment on the prospects for our legislation, given what we heard about the White House, the Senate, and the House. Do our bills have any chance at all, Jim?
Well, as having worked on wilderness bills now for a little over 13 years, my favorite saying is, you're going to have zero chance if you don't get a bill introduced. So you need to start the process. You need to get the bills introduced, build the local support. I don't think it's impossible by any means. The House will be easier with the Democrats in control, even with the narrow margins. And the Senate is going to, regardless of how the special or the runoff elections go in Georgia, very narrow margins there too. So I think good chance for reasonable bipartisan legislation to make it through. But, and as you know, Ryan, wilderness bills, even under the best of conditions, can take 5, 10 years or more to pass. The important thing is get a champion, get them to introduce the bill, and do all the work that we all do day in and day out, which is build local support for.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I would just add, if you had asked anybody 4 years ago whether during Donald Trump's presidency we would be able to get bills like the Dingle Act and the Great American Outdoors Act through, you probably would have said we're crazy. But here we are. And that was done in a divided Congress, not as finely divided as the majorities will be, but still divided, with a president who frankly didn't care unless it was politically advantageous in the moment. The difference now is you'll have a president who presumably cares and can use his bully pulpit to push Republicans to do things they might not do otherwise. The second point would be the reason that those bills came together is because you were able to bring collective interests from people on all sides of the issues together and leverage them against each other. There weren't, if you look at the Dingle Act, every piece of that package was not supported by everybody, but everybody needed something from that package. So I think this is an environment where if we work with the right members of Congress and approach policy from a way that can be supported by more than just progressives, I think we have a chance to be able to get things through in the next few years.
Thank you. Well, earlier Linda mentioned what CalWild's agenda is. We're gonna end, before going into questions and discussion, we're gonna end the presentation by talking a little bit more about that agenda in light of the election results. So one of the first things, so we've talked about the new wilderness bills and wild and scenic river bills that we have. We are the existing ones, I mean. We talked about the new ones that we hope to have. Now, we're going to talk briefly about another priority of ours, which is to increase funding for key agency programs. The Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management and National Park Service have all been starved for funding for decades, frankly. And we really want, now we can't just, get them higher budgets across the board, but we can at least fight for certain programs. And so in working with our partners at Conservation Lands Foundation and Pew and others, we're going to fight to, for example, increase the amount of money that goes to manage protected lands like the National Conservation Lands, wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, places like that. Also, more money for campground maintenance and trail maintenance and the maintenance of existing roads. These are the ways that people get to know their public lands. And so it's very important that they be maintained. So those are some of our priorities. And David, did you have any comments on this?
Yeah, just to reinforce, we, particularly on appropriations to the various accounts within the Bureau of Land Management's operation, even if we have an administration that proposes higher budgets and a Congress that is willing to fund higher amounts for these accounts, you're starting from a point where you have almost nothing, frankly, compared to the number of units in the system. I think, if I remember correctly, the amount that was appropriated in fiscal year 20 for the National Conservation Lands is roughly the same as it was in 2008. And think about how many units of the National Conservation Lands and how many acres have been added to that system since then. Now, part of that was because of the recession and sequestration and other political moves to cut budgets. But the point is, we're going to work every year to move the new administration and Congress to increase those amounts. But even if you have, let's say, a 20% increase, which is by most measures a significant win, that's still only about $10 million to manage all of these places. So it's going to be a very long haul. My organization, and I know CalWild is committed to it, and Pew is as well, and others in the space, but it's going to be a very long time before we can get the federal government to properly fund the management of all of its public lands. One of the things I hope will spur that to move faster is a general commitment from the top down within the administration to refocus federal land management agencies on conservation rather than extraction. If that's kind of the premise of how these agencies operate, there may be other ways to filter funding into ensuring these landscapes are protected with conservation in mind.
Great.
All right, so one of the things we'll be working on is strengthening protections for the California desert. Photographed here is Senator Feinstein, who has been a champion of the California desert since she became a senator. She picked up the baton from Senator Alan Cranston and pushed the California Desert Protection Act of 1994 over the finish line. Through almost a decade of work, she was able to get her California, and I always forget the name of this one, California Desert Protection and Recreation Act, yes, included in an omnibus package of bills that is often referred to as the Dingell Act, which you heard David mention a while ago. The actual name was the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act of 2019. That's why we always say Dingell Act. And this act provided a more protective conservation standard for millions of acres of land in the California desert. Unfortunately, the current administration looked at that language and interpreted it to basically mean nothing. And so we'll be working with our partners on a permanent legislative fix for that problem, or at least at a minimum, seeking to have the new administration update its interpretation of that language so that it will fall in line with what Senator Feinstein had wanted to provide a higher level of protection for special lands in the desert. Senator Feinstein was also responsible for President Obama agreeing to use the Antiquities Act to designate 3 national monuments in the California desert in 2016. Land management plans for 2 of them, Mojave Trails and Santa Snow, Mojave Trails, which is managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and Santa Snow, which is jointly managed by BLM and the Forest Service. Both of them had begun the land management planning process for these monuments, and they were immediately halted, or almost immediately halted, when the new administration came in. And so that's been in limbo. And we certainly haven't pushed on those plans during this administration, but now that we'll have a new administration, a good administration, we'll be pushing for those plans to resume so that hopefully we'll get some good management plans for those monuments. And finally, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, or DRECP. I already mentioned that briefly. It appears, I'm afraid to say this out loud because I feel like I'm going to jinx it, but it appears that the DRECP will remain intact, which is something that we should really, really celebrate. CalWild and our partners and so many people worked really hard to fight back against the administration's proposed changes to the plan. And so now we'll go back to pushing BLM to implement that plan, which is what we had started to do before the Trump administration came in and tried to, or said they were going to dismantle it. And so hopefully that also will provide better management of important conservation areas in the California desert.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, that DRECP plan covers 10 million acres. That's 10% of California, and 10 million of the acres and of the 10 million of, what is it, 15 million that's managed in California. So most of what BLM manages is covered by the DRECP. So very important. The other thing that one of our other priorities for this year is we're fighting trespass marijuana cultivation on public land. This has been an issue. I mean, you know, there's been like background levels of growing on our public lands since, you know, probably the 60s, but it really exploded after 2001 when the United States tightened up its border with Mexico. It became harder to smuggle marijuana into the United States. It became easier to just grow it here and then sell it here rather than smuggle it here and sell it here. So there has been an explosion of cartel associated growing on our public lands. Satellite imagery, for example, found 250 grows on public land in the South Fork Trinity River watershed alone, in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. So it's a serious problem. The growers bring in all the supplies they need for the growing season, and then they leave everything behind at the end of the year except the processed marijuana and their weapons and personal effects. So they leave behind a gigantic mess, including chemicals banned in the United States. Animals are attracted to the food and other material they leave behind, and those animals get poisoned by rat poison and the other herbicides and pesticides that they leave behind. So there are now thousands. We don't know actually how many thousands of abandoned grows there are on our public lands, but it's time that we figure out how many there are, and it's time that we clean them up. And so we're trying to get money from Congress to do that. And this odd couple here, Congressman Doug LaMalfa on the right and Congressman Jared Huffman on the left, and I did not arrange them that way, though I guess that makes sense. They are working together on a bill called the Plant Act, and I can't remember what that stands for, but what it would do is three things. It would increase the criminal penalties for growing. That's number one. Number two, it would allocate money to clean up the grow sites, including $25 million, I believe it is, a year for 5 years, which should, I would hope, be sufficient to clean up the known grow sites or the identified grow sites in California's public lands. And then thirdly, to increase the law enforcement resources that we use to prevent the grows in the first place. That includes things like intelligence on who's who in the cartels, so that we don't just bust some schmuck out in the woods, but instead we bust the boss, you know, wherever the boss happens to be. So those are the kinds of things that the bill would fund. And so that's so the Plant Act will be one of our big priorities for next year.
Hey, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a good question in the chat about the crop project and just the issue itself. one of the impacts or one of the arguments for legalization was to undermine the black market. And folks are just curious about what impact legalization had on public lands growing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that is a great question. And I'm sorry, I couldn't both advance the slides and read the chat. So thank you, Chris, for
That's why I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, so it definitely decreased growing on BLM lands in Humboldt County. I'll tell you that. I was told that by the BLM. However, growing seems to have increased on the BLM lands and the Forest Service lands near the Central Valley. So unfortunately, the cartels are growing here because it's conveniently located, not because of our marijuana laws. They're a whole different, I don't know, Chris, what am I forgetting?
No, I think it is not. There's not a clear-cut answer, but it hasn't dramatically reduced the growing in general on public lands. And the nature, I would say that the biggest change is also the nature of the grows have changed a bit. They're more toxic intensive, and so the impacts can be greater than what we saw. Ryan talking about there were lands all the way back, grows all the way back to the 60s. And so that one chemical that we are focused on in particular is our partner Jackie's gonna kill me if I don't get this right. It's a rodenticide called carbofuran. And anyways, it's a teaspoon of it can kill a 600-pound black bear. And the gentleman in the picture there next to the plants is Dr. Murad Gabriel, who does I would say the bulk of a lot of the cleanup, private sector cleanup. And he has noted the basically 10% increase annually of the use of carbofuran on these grows, and in indiscriminate ways. So it's made the grows harder to clean up, more dangerous for law enforcement. And we're looking at upwards, I think in the last growing season, we don't have numbers for this year, but upwards of 90% of the grows having that chemical on there. So it's a particularly noxious problem now versus what it used to be. We've got it's a good vehicle, the Plant Act, again, bipartisan. So we're hopeful for some progress there.
One other thing I'll say about that is the general trend had been downward on public land grows until COVID. We don't know, as Chris said, we don't know the results of this growing season yet, what COVID did. But anecdotally, we get reports that COVID led to a spike in public land growing because there was a sense that, hey, the cat's away, the mice will play. So.
Yeah. And I would finally just say on the legalization side that the retail market is not as clear and as it could be, and that adds to a thriving black market, which most of these, I would say, plants end up in. So. Oh yeah, and thank you, Andre. It's the Protecting Lands Against Narcotics Trafficking Act.
Oh, thank you, Andre.
All right, so I'm going to take on wildfire policy reform. So CalWild has, for a long time, advocated for getting more fire on the ground in order to help restore the ecological health of our forests. We're working with a group now that is really looking to press this in a new way. Obviously, the catastrophic wildfires of the last 4 years, in particular this year, have presented an increased urgency around dealing with the issue. The challenge there is it is as complex an issue that has as many overlapping elements as you can find. So our approach, the controlled or prescribed burning is an important step to start and increase it. And then more importantly is just to make sure that any kind of policies that come out are science-based and are specifically focused on in and around communities. I think our fear with some of the urgency around dealing with wildfires, and we've kind of been talking about this for the last few years, is what the knock-on effects are for conservation efforts or projects that are termed fuel treatment or forest health projects that turn out to be, disguised as logging projects. There are reasons to do selective thinning in combination with burning in places that have been previously logged, but the wilderness areas, the roadless areas are not those. So we've engaged additionally on this front. This has expanded our role with the state, but the push to find solutions to the wildfire problem in California happened both at the federal as well as the state level. So we'll continue to actively engage both with the states and the feds to find some investments. It's an enormous problem and one that we're going to have to actively engage with to find solutions. So. All right, Linda.
Oops, this one was me. Well, I don't think this takes a whole lot of explanation. I think people have been watching this for the last 4 years. Literally on a daily basis, we've been living a death by 1,000 cuts. Every day we would look at the news and see, yet another thing that the Trump administration had either, completely eliminated or severely watered down. Protections for migratory birds, protection for water, protection for air. I mean, it as we all know, it's been a never ending 4 years. And so one of the things that we'll be doing from a very beginning with this administration is working with them to change that. One of the things that I was really happy to hear, as I think folks know, this administration moved the headquarters for BLM to Colorado in the same building with, I forget which oil company, one of the oil, maybe more than one oil company. Many people refused to move. We lost a lot of really important institutional knowledge and experience. President-elect Biden is already talking about moving the headquarters back and having the Colorado location as just merely a field office or whatever, some sort of office, which is great. And hopefully they'll be able to get back a number of the employees that left. It's crucial for that department to have a DC office to be able to work with the other departments as well as Congress. So we will be doing many requests of the new administration to reverse all of these terrible rollbacks.
And so I guess it's my cue to say that despite all the challenges that we face with a divided Congress and an administration that is dealing with an economic crisis, COVID, and about 1,000 other things that they have to do on every policy issue you could think of to get us back on track. We should consider starting January 20th that we are on offense on all things public lands. I think we should be doing that with respect for the amount of effort and time it will take for the administration to undertake everything. So we shouldn't be impatient if the priority that we have in our minds isn't done in 6 months. But I think just by the measure that if you go to the Biden-Harris transition website, which I think is buildbackbetter.com, you'll see that they have 4 issues that they are focused on there, and one of them is climate change. So clearly, this administration understands the the need to make that a priority, and will be making it a priority over the next 4 years. And most Democrats in Congress, and even some Republicans in Congress, understand that climate change is an issue. And many of them understand the value of protecting public lands in addressing that issue. And so while we should be patient with understanding how long these processes take, we should be moving forward from day one of that new Congress and new administration, focusing them on implementing a federal 30 by 30 legislative and executive strategy so that the entire federal government is focusing on climate change. And as I mentioned earlier, reorganizing federal agencies to focus on conservation mandates for land management rather than extraction. And generally taking economic and scientific actions that help us to mitigate climate change to the extent that we can at this point. So consider yourself running the ball down the field starting January 20th, rather than having to stop the touchdown from being scored.
All right. Well, first, thank you to all the panelists for sharing your knowledge and background on these issues. Just a reminder, if anybody does have any questions, I think we've actually addressed, Steve Evans has been on chat duty here along the way, but most, I think we've touched on most questions here. Thanks, Mike Splain, Ventana Wilderness. The Dolan fire, which recently burned 125,000 acres, also includes it was ignited by cartel grow. So, all right. So I'll just as a first sense, I've got a couple of questions here, so, David, you talked a little bit about what California does and going on offense and that kind of that piece of it. I'm curious the degree to which California can play a role. Obviously, in the last 4 years, it's been much more of a defensive piece. The governor did the 30 by 30 executive order. Are there other things as California we should just think about as far as pushing the national conversation forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, the leadership of both Governor Newsom most recently, but members of the California delegation should be an example that we hold up to the administration of what the federal government should be doing and what they should be encouraging other states to do. And, there are other states that are taking climate change seriously and are looking at implementing a 30 by 30 strategy. But the economics of this, I think, are important, because if I'm right, California is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world in and of itself. And so, if you have a state that has such an economy as California that is deliberately focusing on how to protect landscapes and build economies around that, if California can do that, any state in the union can do that. And of course, that takes political leadership and, in a sense, a belief in the science that proves what's happening. But I think, we should be encouraging the governor to do that. We should be encouraging the California congressional delegation to hold up California as an example. And frankly, I believe having the vice president of the United States being a Californian will help to project that message. So in many ways, I think just all those elements, as was mentioned earlier, a couple of the committee members who are prominent in the House are Californians. So in many ways, California is automatically in the spotlight and able to provide that example. One other thing I'll note also, just kind of the politics of the House, 20% of the Democratic House delegation is Californian. So they carry tremendous weight in policy in general, but particularly on these issues, they clearly set the agenda and the marker that, this is what we're doing here. And in many ways, the examples of how climate change is impacting our state, you may not see that elsewhere, but this is what's happening in California will happen in other states if those states don't approach this issue differently.
right. Jeffrey Smith, let me just get you off of mute here. Oh,
Here we go.
there you are.
Could I ask my question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, everybody. My name is Rip Van Winkle, and I've been asleep for 20 years. It's good to see everyone again.
I'm so sorry. This is quite a time to wake up.
I still have all of our files for East San Diego County wilderness areas, the Eagle Peak Complex, and others,
Nice.
San River, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, I don't have the files. They're at the San Diego River Park Foundation, occupying a place of honor in the corner. 20 file boxes. So my question is, our good friend Daryl Issa has a job again. The hunters are gone. What's the possibility of getting those wilderness proposals on the table again?
That is a great question. So here's my fantasy, okay, is that we can get him to do this one bill and keep it clean, and we have a good experience with it, and he doesn't mess with us or anything, and we get it through, and then we approach, if it all works out and looks good, we approach him again about doing another one. Okay, so we build him up slowly, you know, build our trust up with the guy. But I'd like to use Beauty Mountain as a test, and then of course talk to the local people to see what should be the biggest second priority. I honestly don't know. I know they're talking national monument potentially down near the border. So some people, so there's all sorts of things to do down in that region.
Can I?
So add something to that.
Yeah.
I think we saw in this election, not specifically in California, but in other places, that if you prove to members of Congress who normally don't care about public lands that it is politically advantageous for them to care and to present themselves as advocates for it, they will do it. And I think the prime example is the Montana Senate race with Steve Daines and Governor Steve Bullock. Steve Bullock is a public lands champion. Steve Daines, I think it's not partisan to say that he is not. But he understood that to win the Senate seat in Montana, he needed to outdo Mr. Bullock to prove to voters that he cared enough. And he went out of his way to be one of the lead sponsors in the Senate of the Great American Outdoors Act. And that ultimately probably helped him to win. So 10 years ago, if a Republican didn't care about conservation, they ran on the fact that they were proud that they didn't care about conservation. Now, because they know it'll help them win, because so many people in the West care about protecting public lands, even if they don't necessarily do everything they say, they will talk about how they are a public lands champion. So I think there's an opportunity for Daryl Issa to do the same if he understands that the people in his district care about protecting public lands. And that's, I would argue, part of what CalWild and my organization and others need to do is show him the value of working on this.
Yeah, can you maybe expand that? I mean, you expanded it to Montana, but maybe Jim, talk a little bit. I mean, you talk about having worked with Republicans and Democrats, and you know, I mean, we hear the trope of the day is, you know, we've never been so divided, and I'm just curious about approach and how we should be thinking about you know, bipartisan legislation in this era of you know, rabid partisanship.
Well, personally, I think it comes down to the basics and how you work any wilderness proposal, which is you build local support. Businesses, local electeds, you know, varied groups. And, you know, when you bring the proposal to the member of Congress, you show them that it has, you know, a tremendous amount, broad support across the board. And, you know, they're willing to do it. Let's, you know, most members of Congress are lazy in that they don't want to do things they don't have to do. And it's just the nature of the beast, because people are always asking them for things constantly, as they are always asking people for money so they can get reelected. So if you bring to them a proposal that is sound and solid, makes sense, has this local support, it's very easy for them to proceed with that. And, you know, you can go back to, well, the Central Coast bill that is now championed by Congressman Carbajal. That was first a Republican bill by Elton Gallagher. Wasn't a great bill, but it was a wilderness bill by a Republican member. San Gabriel's original proposal was put forth by a senior Republican of the House, Dreyer, Representative Dreyer. Now, again, not a great bill, but it was, you know, the first of the building blocks to get where we are here. So I think the trick is not to view the member of Congress as a Democrat or a Republican, right? Darrell Issa, when we worked with him 10 years ago, there were groups that were outraged that we were working with him because he was such a partisan Republican. But I think you work with those people who are willing to work with you. You compartmentalize their other positions and actions, and you go forward. You try to do it in a nonpartisan way.
Another thing too is at the same time we're told, gosh, it sure would be great if we had a clean Republican bill that could help serve as a bipartisan, to put together a bipartisan lands package. But there's so few clean Republican bills. So it would be nice if, ISA was willing to do one. It would provide, it might be the seed for, a bipartisan package of lands bills.
So another question we have following up on 30 by 30 from Vicky Hoover is just curious about the role, sort of the Governor Newsom's executive order. We talked about the Biden administration, 30 by 30, federal management policy. Where does the California delegation sit with some of these broader, more ambitious sort of public lands bills or packages?
Like 30 by 30?
Yeah, so there's the federal 30 by 30 bill. I don't know if people know where the California delegation is on it.
Yeah, without having the list in front of me, I believe many of the Democrats in the California delegation are co-sponsors of the 30 by 30 resolution. Probably not Mr. Costa, but those who are perhaps a little more to the left of him. But yeah, I mean, I think a significant percentage, particularly those who are on the committee, the House Natural Resources Committee, support it. Admittedly, the 30 by 30 campaign, and just to make sure everybody on this call understands what that is, because I realize I shouldn't take that for granted. It's actually a campaign that originated with the United Nations and folks around who work on global climate change issues. The concept is that every nation in the world should aim to protect 30% of its lands and waters by 2030, and then eventually 50% by 2050. This is a concept in the United States that actually only started to really advance in the last 12 months. And there are a number of members of Congress who've been promoting it. Many conservation organizations have been promoting it. But, to have an administration that is openly saying they will support it and implement a federal strategy, I think that will elevate the awareness of it in Congress and in the general public's consciousness. So the members of Congress in the delegation who are most proactively engaged in public lands protection, most of them, I believe, are either co-sponsors of that resolution or are supportive of the concept. We'll have to work to make sure more of them are. But at some level, if the Biden administration implements a federal strategy, not that it won't matter whether those members support it, but it's going to be implemented as a federal strategy within the agencies, whether they are engaged or not.
All right. So there's been a lot of noise about sort of this preparing of executive orders reversing Trump administration policies. I wonder if you could highlight any that would be sort of specific to public lands that you have heard of or think would get an early look in the Biden administration. Maybe Jim, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I would. I was desperately trying to think of one specific one as you were asking the question. There are a bunch, and I don't have my notes in front of me. I'll go to the one that they have some questions on, which is they would like to undo President Trump's cutting back of various national monuments in size. Many people feel that President Trump did not have the authority, the legal authority, to reduce the size of national monuments that had been designated by previous presidents, but he went ahead and did so. And I'm not sure the status of some of the court cases there. So President-elect Biden has made it known, or his people have made it known, that he would like to restore these national monuments to their original boundaries. But they are, unlike the current administration, they are actually wrestling with the legality of them to be able to do so. And I don't think they've made any final decisions yet, if they can do it by executive order or not. I would argue yes. I mean, the president can designate a monument, so a way around it might be just to designate a new monument that includes those lands adjacent to the existing monument. But they'll figure something out, and that's, you know, that would be a huge step forward. That was, well, the current president has done, and his administration have done so many things that are, you know, beyond the pale. It's monuments is just one example of it.
Yeah, I'll add. So my organization is actually one of the co-plaintiffs in both court cases with Grand Staircase, Escalante National Monument, and Bears Ears National Monument, and those cases have been waiting for advancement by Judge Chutkan for a very long time. We don't expect that there will be any resolution to them before the new administration comes in, and at that point, we will probably just have, you know, be working with the new Justice Department to, you know, for the federal government to withdraw their position. So we will probably not get a judgment on those cases, which is actually unfortunate because I think it's okay for me to say that we were hoping to get an affirmative decision from the courts that says a president does not have the legal authority to shrink monuments under the Antiquities Act. And unless something happens in the next 64 days, that's not going to happen. And so that complicates, as Jim mentioned, the way that President-elect Biden can approach these issues. I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to the nuances of that process, but he will definitely be reversing those in some form or fashion so that the original monuments are restored. I think, you know, among the very long list of things that he will also do, probably very early on, is reversal of the new NEPA regulations so that the spirit and purpose of NEPA is restored, including ensuring proper public comment opportunity, particularly in a pandemic, and particularly for tribal communities who have, in many cases, almost an impossible many of them don't have high-speed internet, so they can't participate in a webinar to provide public comment. So I imagine restoring NEPA and probably also, frankly, restoring the way that federal agencies respond to Freedom of Information Act requests. That's another big one that many of our organizations have been dealing with in how we've dealt with court cases against the administration. But, also, you've got a list of probably hundreds of resource management plans that need to be frozen to be reviewed. So my understanding is the administration will, and I think this is pretty typical of any administration, from the minute that he's sworn in, there's either I think it's either a 60 or a 90-day automatic freeze on all Federal Register notices and decisions that go through the Federal Register, so that the new administration has a chance to review everything that the previous administration was doing. So if things haven't been decided by then, for example, Linda mentioned the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, presumably if there's no changes made to that by then, what has been ongoing now for about 3 years is a plan review. That plan review would be frozen and presumably stopped once the administration has a chance to understand what was happening there and realize that rather than reviewing and changing the plan, it should be implemented.
Well, just we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank everyone who was able to join, who stuck it out for the whole time. I especially want to thank David and Jim for taking the time out to share their insights. Very interesting, dynamics and how Congress will work moving forward, what the administration will prioritize. And yeah, I just really appreciate you taking the time to share with everyone your experience and knowledge, because it feels like there's a lot of moving parts, and having a little more clarity is helpful for me at least. So thank you, everyone. We'll continue to hold webinars as things change. Obviously, we have some uncertainty here for now, but likely we'll get a little bit more clarity as in the coming months. So we'll continue to look for new opportunities to keep you informed. If you have any suggestions or any requests for what to learn more about, you can write me, email me. I'll put my email here in the chat just one last time. And we welcome your questions to dive deeper. So thank you again from all of us at CalWild. Please stay safe, stay healthy in these trying times. And we look forward to the fight in the months and years ahead. So thank you all. Take care and have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.